Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. The leadership of Muhammad. On a journey, the leader of a people is their servant, Muhammad, by John Adair. Chapter 2. The Shepherd. There is no prophet that has not worked as a shepherd. Muhammad used to say. Did you do so? Asked one present. Yes, he replied, I herded sheep as a boy. We do not know when the Prophet served as a shepherd, or for how long, or for whom he worked. But in retrospect, Muhammad clearly saw this period as providential. It was almost as he saw it a necessary condition for being called as a prophet. It happened, of course, long before he knew that to be his destiny. In this chapter, I shall ask you to consider the possible lessons of leadership that Muhammad, as an intelligent and observant youth, might have gleaned from long days and nights shepherding a flock of sheep and goats in the wadis that threaded through the sun-baked hills and mountains around Mecca. Is that, I wonder, when he first came upon the cave where later, in about the year 610, he would come for weeks to be alone with God. David was 30 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 40 years. In the Quran, he is called a prophet, as the authorship of the book of Psalms is attributed to him. The Psalmist 78, chapter 78, verses 70 to 72, summed up his vocation in these words. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds, from tending the ewes that had young. He brought him to be the shepherd of Jacob, his people of Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart he tended them and guided them with a skillful hand. It is clear from this passage that probably the strongest ancient metaphor for a leader is that of the shepherd. Classical authors such as Homer and Xenophon had used the same image. Given our present knowledge of leadership, it is a singularly rich image. We know now that someone in a leadership role has three core and overlapping functions to achieve the tasks, to hold the group together as a unity, and to meet individual needs. We know also that leadership is essentially a journey word. we know also that leadership is essentially a journey word. Putting these two insights together may help us to understand why the shepherd metaphor is so fertile in overtones and implications. It is a simple and serviceable model for a future leader, even though the lessons would have been more implicit than explicit. The shepherd gave direction to the flock by leading it from the front, sometimes walking for up to 20 miles a day in search of the sparse grass that grows in the wilderness, or even the pastures of the wilderness. Psalm 65:12, John 2:22, were welcome in the spring when the desert is green with the fresh grass and flowers that will burn up in the summer heat. Lambs naturally follow their mothers, whilst fully grown wild sheep that live in bands follow their dominant ram. To mark their paths, sheep have hoof glands that give off scent. Early humans in the Mediterranean basin, at least as long ago as 6000 BCE, observed this phenomenon, and so that docile sheep could be tamed and induced to follow a human leader instead of a ram. Shepherds in the hill country and in the wilderness had dogs, but the dogs were kept to protect the flocks of sheep and goats, and not used to round the flocks up or drive them. As a rule, shepherds go before the flock, but not infrequently they are seen behind it. Shepherds walk behind, especially in the evening when the flock is on its way to the fold, in order that they may gather the stragglers to protect them from the stealthy wolf. They may gather the stragglers, and protect them from the stealthy wolf. Shepherds also often walk by the side of the flock, somewhere around the middle of the straggling line. In the case of large flocks, the chief shepherd goes before, and the under shepherd or helper brings up the rear. Keeping the flock close together was essential for its safety. No shepherd would go so far ahead as to lose sight or be out of earshot of the sheep. The natural instinct of predators such as wolves and hyenas was to scatter the flock and then kill their individual victims. Therefore, the unity or cohesiveness of the flock was important to shepherds. If they saw a sheep or goat wandering off, they called it back. Should it still walk away, they hurled a stone from their sling so as to fall just beyond it and send it scurrying back to the flock. If a sheep became lost on the hills, Matthew 13:12, in the hills and gullies of the Judean wilderness, the shepherd had to decide whether or not to leave the flock in order to go in search of it. If several shepherds had charge of the flock if several shepherds had charge of the flock, it was easier for one to go off, but even so, the departure would weaken the collective strength of the shepherds, for the main threat to the flock came more from armed raiders rather than small mountain panthers or leopards, lions, bears, jackals, hyenas, and wolves, which roamed in parts of Arabia in ancient times. The shepherd then came to personify unity, hence the proverb quoted by Jesus, "Smite the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." Smite the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. In order to keep their flocks safe and together at night, a time of greater danger, shepherds often herded them into the limestone caves that abound in the hills, or they made sheep folds with dry stone walls. In desert areas where stones could not be found, they constructed their folds from thorn bushes. Wolves sometimes defied the dogs and leaped over these barriers, and so shepherds might keep some of the lambs and young kids close to their tent for the night. O fairest among women, sings the author of the Song of Solomon 1:8, follow in the tracks of the flock and pasture your kids beside the shepherd's tents. Flock in Arab lands are often composed of sheep and goats, which are much more unruly than sheep alone. Goats tend to be black-white, sheep while sheep in contrast are white, as they are easy to distinguish at a distance. Goats are especially fond of nibbling young leaves, but will eat scrub, whereas sheep prefers a fresh, short grass if they can find it. But sheep and goats in mixed flocks do not always coexist happily, and the shepherd must work to keep them together harmoniously. This characteristic made it often necessary to separate the goats from the sheep in the fold. In all human groups and organizations, there are similar tendencies to internal divisiveness. The perpetual journey of shepherds and their flocks brought danger and hardship for all of them. The shepherds shared these dangers on an equal footing with the sheep. Shepherds carried no more than a bag or wallet, together with the staff and sling. The summer sun hurt or burnt shepherds and flocks by day, and all shivered in the winter snows and icy winds. Shepherds and sheep ran the risk of attacks by wild animals or of treading on deadly vipers that lurked in the limestone rocks. It is not hard to believe that the shepherds came to love their charges. Each could be recognized individually and called by name. Therefore, it is not surprising that the metaphor of the caring shepherd was applied to God. Therefore, it is not surprising that the metaphor of the caring shepherd was applied to God. The 23rd Psalm is the song of an individual sheep, a person whose every need has been met by God and the shepherd. Like all analogies, the metaphor of the shepherd for a leader of people does not break down eventually. People and sheep obviously differ in number. People and sheep obviously differ in a number of important respects, but the broad functions of leadership are contained in the image. Shepherds respond to three kinds of implicit needs present in the flock. Flocks need to find food, and so the shepherd leads them on earth to flocks need to find food, and so the shepherd leads them on the path to their desired destination. The shepherd holds them together in a cohesive and harmonious unity, and lastly, the shepherd meets their individual needs. Shepherd know each sheep or goat by name. They make sure that it finds the right food and enough water. They appoint an individual plants and sheep thorn wounds. Shepherds know each sheep or goat by name. They make sure that it finds the right food and enough water. They anoint an individual sheep's thorn wounds with oil. They tend a sick animal until it recovers strength. A joyful moment would come at sunset when the shepherd who had led out the flock of sheep in the morning brought them all safely back to the fold. It is one thing to lead people out on a journey, but it is another thing to bring them safely home. That analogy holds good for all forms of leadership. The successful leader, for example, is the one who brings the army home in safety, and if it is victorious in triumph, to a great welcome with all the joys and the celebration of such a shortcoming. For soldiers in all ages, there is no sweeter experience. Both Moses and David had worked as shepherds, and the implication is that some of the qualities and skills learned there are transferable to the leadership of people and ultimately to the nation. David guided the human flock entrusted to him by God with a skillful hand. It is difficult not to believe that in his youth Jesus also had the care of the families and neighbors' sheep and goats among the hills of Galilee, for the imagery of the shepherd informs his teaching on leadership. The Greek word for good in the saying attributed to Jesus, I am the good shepherd, John 10:14, is kalos, meaning skillful, as opposed to agathos, which means morally good. Good shepherd leaders master the skills of leadership. They know their business. There are no hirelings who will run away at the first hint of danger. If need be, they will always lay down their lives for the sheep entrusted to them. The vision of a flock of sheep without shepherd was the most powerful image in the ancient world for the need of a leader. On one of the very first clay tablets found, the words earliest writing was incised in cuneiform, a Sumerian proverb. Soldiers without a leader are like sheep without a shepherd. It seems God calls a person to become a leader of a flock through the perception of the need for leadership. Moses had responded himself to that call to become the needed leader, and in due course he appointed as his successor Joshua, a man with the Spirit in him, as one who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep which have no shepherd. Numbers 27:17. One day when Muhammad was walking with others in the shade of the date palm trees in Medina, some boys passed him carrying some baskets of arak berries. Muhammad looked at his companions. Pick me out the blackest of them, for they are sweet, he said to them. Ones like that I used to gather when I fed the flocks when I fed the flocks of Mecca at Jihad. They brought him the choicest of the fruit. Surely there has been no prophet raised up who did not do the work of a shepherd, said Muhammad once again, as if reflecting to himself. Key points: and leadership is done from in front. In the human context, a human leader may not always on a physical journey be the person out in front, just as the shepherd sometimes works behind the moving flock, but spiritual leader is the one who leads from the front. In leadership, example is everything. As the Moorish proverb says, when the shepherd is corrupt, so is his flock. Apart from leading the flock to pasture and water across the wilderness, shepherds have to keep the flock together and care for each individual sheep or lamb. They will know the sheep by name, and the sheep in turn will know the shepherd's voice. A good Greek kalos skilled, a good Greek skilled shepherd meets on the level of the flock of sheep the three interactive circles of needs that are present in all human work groups at all times in history to achieve the common task to be held together as a working unity, and the needs that individuals bring into the group by virtue of being individual embodied persons. A good Greek agathos, morally good, shepherd is interested in the welfare of people, not in fleecing. When leaders are worthy of respect, the people are willing to work for them. When their virtue is worthy of admiration, their authority can be established. Alhamdulillah.